כל בית ישראל, אחינו, כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. אחינו, כל בית ישראל, אחינו, כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם עליהם ויוציאם מצרה לרווחה, ומאפלה ליורה ומשעבוד לגאולה, השתה בגלה ובזמן קריב.
Hi everyone, welcome. We are so glad to see you here. My name is Rabbi Jenna, and I'm the Associate Director of Israel Campaigns and Education here at Trua, and I use the pronouns they and them. And I'm here with my colleague, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Trua, and we are so looking forward to sharing glimpses into our trip and our experiences. Trua brings together more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors from all streams of Judaism, together with members of the Jewish community, to act on the Jewish imperative to respect and advance the human rights of all people. And before we begin, I want to share a few logistical notes. First, given that so many of us are feeling raw and emotions are running high right now, we've decided to disable the public chat for our conversation today. Our emotions matter, and they're so deeply a part of what makes us human. So I want to we make no judgment on what you may be feeling and on any reactions you might have based on what can be said. But a chat can so easily be misunderstood or fired off quickly. So we want to make sure that everyone here is safe to feel and to experience this call in the way that we need to. If you need anything or have any questions throughout our call, please send a chat or any message to Rabbi Matt Dreffin, and Matt will collect those questions or any reactions and share them our way. And we apologize in advance if we're not able to get to your question or your comment. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning is available, so if you need that, please select that option on Zoom. And if you have any other access needs, don't hesitate to reach out to Rabbi Matt Dreffin, and he can help you out. Truly what a gift to be with you all today.
Thank you to Rabbi Jenna. I'm Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Trua. Before we start, I want to say that just a few hours ago, we heard the really tragic news of the death of Rabbi David Ellenson, who was a friend and teacher of mine, and I know of many on this call. And I would say that even if you never met him in person, that you have been influenced in some way by him or by one of his students. He was a longtime president of Hebrew Union College and professor and leader in the Jewish community. And I'll say that he was somebody who was a scholar and a rabbi, but most importantly, just the menschiest of mensches. I think anybody who knew him has a story about a time that he reached out. I have a memory that I think I was late in rabbinical school or right out of rabbinical school. And I went to JTS. I didn't go to HEC. I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, but I knew him originally because he was a frequent teacher at the Wexner um, for the Wexner Fellows. And I reached out for help with something, I can't remember what, and he responded and he said, well, of course, I would do anything for one of my students. And I said, David, I'm not actually one of your students. I don't go to your school. And it just didn't matter. And there's so many stories like that of people who really didn't even know him, who got nice notes from him. I was just looking back at my last emails from him, and we hadn't been in touch in the last couple of months. But before that, I had an email from him sending along like a pre-print of a journal article he'd written about Israel and democracy. And he was somebody who just had such deep love for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel. And for that reason, we're dedicating this session to him today.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacobs. And it feels like such a humbling experience to get to speak to the experience that we had in memory and honor in love of Rabbi David Ellenson, and such an incredible teacher and role model to so many. Rabbi Jacobs and I are so excited to share about what we learned, what we heard, and what we witnessed during our week in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Our general goal for the trip was to witness, hear, and to uplift stories that aren't necessarily making their way to the US news headlines. So our goal was to feel what it felt like on the ground, and hear from our many partners, Israeli and Palestinian, about what their needs are in this moment and what they're experiencing right now. So we're going to share our experiences in a few thematic areas. As we said before, don't hesitate to send any questions to Rabbi Matt Dreffin.
So I'll just say there's a content warning here. Some of these photos are very challenging. Jenna and I joined for a day a group of rabbis from the DC area to travel down south. And one of the places we went was Kfar Aza, which of course was just devastated on October 7th. And I'll just point out a few photos and then we'll take them down so that we don't have to keep looking at them. We were shown around by Chaim Kotler, who's a member of the kibbutz leadership. And let me just first talk about the photos. We'll take them down and I'll say a little bit about what else we experienced there. So just moving from right to left, you can see that this is the sukkah that's still up from Sukkot because, of course, who's going to take it down? Nobody's living there. Nobody's there to take it down. It also felt very stark that a sukkah, which of course is a temporary and flimsy structure, was still standing. It looked fine. It looked probably just like it looked 2 months ago, whereas of course the houses were devastated. In the middle picture, you'll see this is a house, a door with bullet holes in it that has been checked by Zakaz, the volunteer organization that goes after terror attacks to make sure to collect the bodies and unfortunately the parts of bodies so that they can have a Jewish burial. And I just want to say that this group is doing unbelievably sacred and holy work, just the most holy work. And this is, of course, the hardest work they've ever had to do. They've unfortunately gone through many eras of terror attacks, from the Second Intifada to through now, where there's maybe a few people who were killed, or dozens of people, but not like this, where there were more than 1,200 people killed, and they were the ones who were there to ensure the appropriate Jewish treatment of all of the bodies. And I'll say also that we were really careful. We're very aware that these are people's homes. And so you'll see in the pictures that we took, we wanted to make sure that we don't show the house, that it's just a little bit of a door or a little bit of a wall, that it's not recognizable as somebody's house. The picture on the left, this is probably the hardest home that we saw. You can see, for those who read Hebrew, it says Sridei Adam al Hasapa, that there's human remains found on the sofa. In the same house, there was also a Sharpie marker saying that there was a terrorist there, somebody who was dead, also found there. And we peeked inside this home and saw there was a dish in the sink that had been unwashed. Presumably the person was planning to wash it the morning of October 7th. There were There were bags of M&Ms that somebody was planning to eat. This was this was in an area of the kibbutz that was really devastated, which was the area where young adults live. So people who are, who grew up in the kibbutz, who are in their early 20s maybe, where they just have these little 1-room or 2-room houses. So they're on the kibbutz in their own area to hang out. And of course, people in the prime of with their whole lives ahead of them. For me, walking around, I had just really strong memories of after September 11th in New York, which many of you might remember the smell that was in the air for weeks and weeks, and it was that same horrific smell. I will also say that it was an ethical challenge for us to be there. We wanted to be there in a way that felt right. We talked a lot about how we're going to bring these stories back. We think that it's really important that people see these sites, especially because unfortunately there's conspiracy theories that are traveling around saying that October 7th never happened, or that it didn't, or that it was done by the ADF, not by Hamas, which are of course lies and dangerous conspiracy theories. And also we're aware that these are people's homes and that people lost their lives, that people lost their family members, that people were kidnapped. One of the stories, so we're bringing back these stories to tell a couple of these pictures to tell a couple of particular stories. One major story is that of the abandonment of the people in the South, that for years and years and years, the people who lived in these kibbutzim were saying, the government has abandoned us. There's no security here. They were not funded. There was a lot of talk about about people in these kibbutzim and people in Sderot and surrounding areas, but not actually government investment in them in any way. And they've been saying that for years, that they felt abandoned. And they were abandoned again on October 7th and have been abandoned since then. Chen, who was taking us around, read us a series of WhatsApp conversations from the kibbutz chat from October 7th, people saying, the terrorists are my house. Somebody please go to so-and-so's house. Has anybody heard from so-and-so? Does anybody know how to hold the door of the safe room? And on and on and on, just horrific for hours and hours and hours, because the army didn't come. And they, even with all of the warnings that the army had, even it took horrifically hours and hours that people were just left to their own devices, including because the army was disproportionately in the West Bank protecting settlers there. And of course, since October 7th, Bibi still has yet to meet with the representatives of the kibbutzim. In Kfar Aza, just the day before we were there, Bibi had brought Elon Musk, who of course is facilitating anti-Semitism on X, through Kfar Aza, and they walked through one house and videoed it, and the person whose house it was, who's alive and displaced, put out a video saying, that's my house, and you never called me, and you never got my permission, and you can't just, I know my house is destroyed, but you can't just walk through it. So to this day, President Biden has met with representatives of the kibbutzim, and the Prime Minister of Israel still won't even face them. And so that's also part of the story, that these communities were abandoned and continue to be abandoned.
And to the theme of the abandonment of the government that was felt by so many, it was a story and a narrative that was echoed time and time again, that people were saying, we're activists, yet the government is letting us down, or we feel that we have bought into this and we are continuously just being let down and abandoned by the government. An area in which was a prominent part of our conversation was, and our experiences, was the hostages. We happened to be there during the last 3 days of the temporary ceasefire. So when we arrived, Rabbi Jill and I immediately went to Hostage Square in time for some hostage releases. And there was singing and there was music and there was people, and you could feel this deep, deep sense of hope and desire, but also the longing and the pain and the sense of psychological torture of, will my loved one get out? Is tonight the night? Is what will happen at one day it's one time, the other day it's another time, and there's just such deep fear. And what was so clear in our conversations is that everyone is connected to someone, and everyone is connected to the stories of these hostages there. And because so many of the hostages were from kibbutzim, many of them were left-wing, were activists. And so the government was really not interested in protecting them. There were stories of Sarah Netanyahu checking social media pages of hostages' families before reaching out to them to see if they were involved in the democracy protests. And it just felt so clear that they were not a priority. And as a result, in the midst of the deep pain and the deep grief that these families were experiencing, you'll see in this photo the selfie is taken in front of the Families Forum in Tel Aviv. And this was one of the most impressive operations I've ever seen. And as someone who is a big fan of the West Wing, I felt like I was watching West Wing on steroids. And what it was the families of the hostages plus hundreds and hundreds of volunteers have set up an operation to basically run the country. They had gotten a tech company in Tel Aviv to donate their office space. It's 6 stories, and each story is a different floor representing some need. They serve hundreds of meals to families who have either lost their homes or are displaced for whatever reason. They have therapists and hundreds of volunteer therapists who are meeting with the families and other volunteers. They have former retired diplomats who are working to get the hostages released and doing anything they can in terms of diplomacy. They have media teams and creative teams, and the list goes on and on and on. And it was an incredibly powerful representation of the ways in which both that they're holding their grief and using their grief as a tool to help others and to speak and to make a difference, but also that the deep, deep abandonment from the government, it so clearly demonstrated that the goals were not with the people. And you can see these photos here are next to the selfie are from Hostage Square, a square in Tel Aviv where it's become kind of a gathering place of hostage families and allies.
Thanks. Maybe actually, can you put that slide back up for 1 second? Just on I want to just say something about religion, about the role of Judaism. So there is a resurgence in Israel. People are trying to connect to their Jewish roots in Hostage Square. There was singing of Tehillim, of Psalms. People are. I hear that you can't buy a Siddur, you can't buy a prayer book in the whole country. They're sold out. People are really connecting. And one thing that I encountered a little bit before Jenna arrived from their flight was this very sweet scene on the bottom right corner. There was a tent set up, and there was some singing of Tehillim, of Psalms, and then a sofer, a scribe, a Torah scribe, got up and he gave a short Devar Torah in which he talked about he talked about how the Torah scroll is not complete without all of its letters, etc., just like the Jewish people needs all of its people. And then he invited anybody who wanted to come write a letter of the Torah with him, anybody, any gender, anybody who was there. And it was this very, to say the blessing with him, to hold the quill, and to, as he wrote the letter. And it was this very sweet and also I'll say that in that he quoted the Gabayit, the female synagogue leader in kibbutz Be'eri. And it was this very sweet moment where maybe there's a putting aside of other kinds of religious differences to say that we're all in this together, and also we can learn from Torah. And with that, I also want to say about Pidyon Shvu'im, redemption of captives, which is one of the most important mitzvot, that there's some very strong voices from the religious left who are calling out the government on their abandonment of hostages, also some people from the not religious left who are calling it out. And I just want to offer a little bit of Torah. There's a lot of discussion in halakha and Jewish law about pidyon shvuim. Unfortunately, it's something that's come up again and again over the centuries. And one of the questions is to what extent do you go to redeem hostages? The worry, of course, always, and including now, is if the price is too high, does that encourage the taking of hostages? And I'll just share one little piece from Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv from the 70s through the late 90s. He died in 1998, where he talks about this question of the price. And then he goes on at the end, he says, after talking about it, he says, look, besides all of these arguments, here's one of the main things, that we're unfortunately in this situation where there's going to be war for a long time, and hoping there's not going to be war. And then he's talking only about the situation where soldiers are captured, because nobody imagined that people would kidnap babies. So he's talking about the situation of soldiers, which used to be the more common thing. And he says, basically, in addition to everything else, that there's also an issue of morale, that no soldier is going to go out and fight unless they know that the state is backing them up. And he ends and he says, which is the bigger security threat? Is it the strengthening of the power of the terrorists through freeing their fellows, their friends? Or is it the strengthening of the morale of the soldiers of Tzahal, the IDF, for future wars, basically, in which there's a chance that they might be taken as hostage? This idea that the most important thing is that the people who are at risk of being taken hostage, which used to be soldiers, now unfortunately is also babies, need to know that the state is backing them up. And part of the story right now is that maybe isn't getting communicated so well in the United States, is that there is a sense in Israel that the government has just completely abandoned the hostages. Here, for some reason, in the US, there's an idea that the hostages are a right-wing issue. We see this with people who are supposedly pro-Palestinian tearing down the posters saying they're war propaganda, and that is 100% the opposite in Israel, where the hostages are absolutely a left-wing issue, including because many of them were peace activists and their kibbutzim were involved in peace and coexistence efforts. And also there's a very real sense that the government has just made the decision to abandon the hostages in order to continue the war, to prioritize the war. We saw while we were there the brief ceasefire, which resulted in the release of more than 100 women and children. And that was very much the pressure of the hostages' families, who are protesting, tens of thousands of them protesting the government. And now that we've seen the horrific condition of the people have returned, and they've reported on what it was like there, and how little time people who are still there have, there's even more pressure and more of a sense from those families that the government has made that decision to just abandon those people, which is just an entire breach of the social contract of the state with its population, of a state that's supposed to protect the Jewish people. Okay, so I want to move on and say that we spent a lot of our time talking to our human rights partners on the ground, including folks from Breaking the Silence and ACRI and Gisha and the Beryl Katz-Nelson Center and Yisrael Chofshit, Israel, I don't know how they translated it, is free, Israel be free, I think they say, which works on religious pluralism, and a number of other human rights and civil society organizations. And all of these leaders who we met with first have been directly affected. That's really important to say. They all have lost people, almost all have lost people. Some of them themselves barely survived. The head of Rabbis for Human Rights, Avi Dabush, lived in kibbutz Nirim and was in his safe room for, I think, 11 hours and is now evacuated with his family. So people were directly affected. They've lost people. They have people who are kidnapped. And they are doing an extraordinary job of telling that story of how this war has affected them, continues to affect them. They're also dodging missiles. Many of them are deployed or who have close family members who are deployed, not only in Gaza, but also in the Lebanon border, which is an area that people are not really talking about as much. But of course, there's also constant fighting there, as well as now drones and things from Yemen. And they're at the same time trying to hold up a moral voice that recognizes the humanity of Palestinians and Israelis. And it's something that I think we can all aspire to be able to both be in grief and fear and also say, and at the same time, Israel is not taking appropriate precautions to avoid civilian deaths in Gaza, to say that we need to return to that temporary ceasefire in order to release more hostages, to say that Israel needs to allow in humanitarian relief to Gaza, that children, everybody wants Hamas gone. Everybody wants the people in the kibbutzim to be able to move home, as well as the people up north who are also displaced, and to say that that can't be at the price of killing more children. And that is a nuanced and complicated position that these human rights leaders are holding up. I think it's a challenge for all of us in the United States, where things are so polarized and people feel like they have to pick one side or the other to try to say all of the things with nuance. These folks are also fighting for the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel who were also affected, were also murdered and kidnapped and lost people, and are being treated with suspicion, including crackdowns on freedom of speech. And so also the human rights civil society organizations, which are made up of both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, are also holding up the rights of, the free speech rights, but particularly of Palestinian citizens. And then finally, I'll also say that there's that people on the right in Israel are trying to incite violence between Jewish and Palestinian citizens, and thankfully they're not succeeding. And the reason they're not succeeding is because the Jewish and Palestinian citizens are refusing to allow them to succeed and are doing things like having citizen patrols in mixed cities. In Tel Aviv, there's a hotline you can call if you witness any kind of incitement or violence, and really just have done an amazing job of making sure that this fight doesn't end up wreaking havoc within Israeli society.
And I'll say part of the people that we met with were there's a couple of arms of the left, just like in the US, there's a couple of arms of the left. And one of the arms is predominantly a Mizrahi-led left that focuses on both solidarity and domestic issues of inequality that exist within Israel. And what we heard from those activists is that many of them, because of the crackdowns on freedom of speech, many of those activists feel like they need to flee the country and feel like they can't live in Israel anymore. And thinking about all of the injustices that take place beyond the borders of Israel, thinking about the violence internally and the impacts internally to activists is incredibly, incredibly scary. And I will just name that the situation there is incredibly dire. Everyone that we met with mentioned that they had children who were being sent to the army. They had relatives who were being sent to the army and into Gaza. Everywhere we walked, there were armed people. And the impacts of this war and the dangers and the fear for life is felt so, so deeply. And we met with the Military Court Watch, which is a group that monitors the impact of Palestinians that are being held in Israeli prisons. And as we mentioned earlier, the situations and the impact of the hostages is so dangerous. They mentioned how dangerous and how brutal the conditions are for the Palestinians who are being held in these jails as well. Switching gears a little bit to our next category, Victoria, if you're able to pop up the next slide. One of Trua's many powerful programs is that many of the North American rabbinical schools and cantorial schools send students to Israel and Palestine for the year. And Trua has for many years run a program where we provide these students with the opportunity to hear narratives about Palestinians, around issues of justice, and about the many, many diverse narratives that exist within Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. On October 7th, many of the students that were spending their year there in Jerusalem had some left and some stayed. And the students who stayed are having an incredibly difficult experience. They mentioned that for them, it feels like this is, whether they like it or not, going to be permanently a part of their rabbinate. They are the group of students that were in Jerusalem when this war broke out. They're the students who have to sit with the fear and the trauma of what they witnessed. They also mentioned that they feel a very deep separation from what is happening in the US. And they have so many questions and they want to know how does their role fit into the role of US activism when they return from their year, and how does US activism fit into the work and their experiences that they're having. Overwhelmingly, when we asked them the type of things that they needed, they mentioned a deep desire to hear Palestinian voices. They felt like that was something that they were unable to get, and they were seeing the impact of occupation, but they wanted a deeper analysis of occupation, and they felt like it was becoming increasingly clear. And they were incredibly grateful to feel this sense that that we had brought together students and people who were sharing a similar perspective and were having similar experiences who had previously not met. So it felt like a glimmer of hope to sit with these rabbinical students and see their experiences and hear through their eyes what the future could look like for them working together going forward.
Thanks. Let's move to the next slide. So this is on a different note. We spent a day and a half with Palestinians in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So these slides are from a Palestinian village called al-Walaje that's half in East Jerusalem and half in the West Bank, in Area C of the West Bank, which is the part that is under full Israeli control. And this is a village we've been working with for a couple of years now, along with many of our partner organizations like Americans for Peace Now and Aminu. And this village has a particular story, which is that as many of you might know, in East Jerusalem, it's essentially impossible to get housing permits. And so that means that people are in a catch-22 where if they build anything, it's illegal, so then it can get demolished, but you can't actually get a permit to build anything, which makes it very hard. Your kid grows up and they get married and they want to have a home of their own, but there's no way to either build onto your house or to build them a new home. And so that was the situation in al-Walaje. They're also in a unfortunate situation because they are inside the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, but they're on the wrong side of the wall. The wall actually runs through Jerusalem, and that means that they're cut off from any municipal services. So they don't get garbage pickup, they don't get water, they don't get schools, they don't get any municipal services. Everything they have to buy from the West Bank. So the kids go to school, they pay for them to go to school in Bethlehem, they buy water from Bethlehem, etc. The only municipal services they get, as they like to say, is bulldozers. The very first time I visited a couple of years ago, I really horrifically watched the home of a newlywed couple being bulldozed because it was under demolition order, because it was built illegally. It was an old building that had been refurbished, but the new construction was done illegally, but that's because there's no way to do it legally. But the maybe good news, hopefully good news, is that also a couple of years ago, the village went to the courts and asked to be able to work on a master zoning plan. The reason that all of the construction is illegal and there's no permits is officially because there's no master plan for the village, which is a responsibility of the municipality to come up with a master plan for every neighborhood, but they don't. And they were able to get protection for 38 homes that they can't be demolished. There's another half dozen or so homes that can be demolished, and to get permission to start working on a master plan, which they're doing with a planner and with some Israeli organizations, Iramim and Bimcom. And every few months, they have to go back to the court, present where they are, and ask for the time to work on it. And so far, they've always gotten that. The court has always been really impressed with what they've done. And they just had a court date this past Monday, right after we were there. And the court basically the state asked for 4 months to prepare their arguments against the village. And the court essentially said, this has gone on too long. It doesn't make any sense. This village is a particular situation. And so we don't have a decision yet, but it seems like there's potentially good news in terms of a master plan. And so we were hosted by Hassan Abu Altin, who's one of the leaders of the village council, and his wife Basma, who attempted to teach Jenna and me to make grape leaves, which I think Jenna managed to do. I did not. And have just been really generously, unbelievably hospitable to us over a couple of years. And we're trying to bring that story forward and hope that there will be good news for this village very soon.
Another story of Palestinian experience that we witnessed is that we spent a day with Rabbis for Human Rights in the Jordan Valley. And Rabbis for Human Rights is an organization that has been doing a lot of something called protective presence in the West Bank. And I'll get to explaining what protective presence is in a little bit, but a little bit of a background of what the Jordan Valley is, where it is it's between Jordan and around the Dead Sea area. And it constitutes about 30% of the West Bank. And there's about 65,000 Palestinians that live there and about 11,000 settlers. And it's one of the most significant land reserves for Palestinians, and is a place where Israel has taken over much of the land and is kind of a hotbed of occupation. It's difficult to access water, and there's restrictions on land and accessing land that Palestinians experience. And one of the ways in which that happens is that settlers backed by the army have free range on attacking and threatening and just threatening Palestinians who are living their lives. And so and since October 7th, the impact of the violence towards Palestinians has just escalated and has gotten to become so dire that many of the people feel like they can't even begin to live their lives. So we spent the day with a family of cow herders, which was a term that neither one of us had ever heard of, but we're very excited to learn. And we were protective presence for them, meaning that settlers backed by the army, many of whom are armed, will dress up in army gear and terrorize these Palestinians, coming up with one story or another to justify their terror and their threats. And so we, with Rabbis for Human Rights, our role was to be there in case the army come, to ensure the safety of the herders. So we spent a lovely day with the people as they were herding. As someone who, my favorite animal is cows, they gave me the opportunity to actually pet the cows. And I was sitting with the cow. One of the herders was teaching me about how to pet the baby cow, the calf. And all of a sudden, an armed settler showed up. We were really minding our own business, and it felt like everything had changed in that instance. And the Rabbis for Human Rights people went and they negotiated with this person. And he said the reason he was there was that his friend's cows had gotten mixed up with the cows that these Palestinians were herding, which was absolutely not true. And so after a lot of conversations back and forth, he finally left. And he left because there were people standing guard, Jews. And he very easily could have come back with friends. He could have come back with more guns. The family that we were with mentioned that they know all of the cars of the settlers who come and terrorize them, and they're terrified. The psychological impact of it is gruesome. They know what will happen, and they're terrified of what will happen when settlers arrive.
So just to let everyone know, we've opened up the chat. We realized there was an issue with sending it to the host. So if you'll just send, if you have any questions for Jill or Jenna, Rabbi Jacobs or Rabbi Shaw, feel free to send them to me. Tech support, Rabbi Matt Dreffin, that's me. Before we get to those questions, Rabbi Shaw, Rabbi Jacobs, do you have any, you were gone for a week and we saw just a little bit of information. We know you were real busy. Are there any takeaways from this trip or key observations that you noticed that you absolutely would love for us to know about?
I'd say two themes. We said this before, but I'll just say again. First, the level of nuance. I mean, we were talking to human rights and civil society leaders for the most part, right? We weren't talking to everybody in the country. We weren't polling the country, but it's just an unbelievable level of nuance and really thickness of the experience that people have here. That here things are so polarized, and you are pro-Palestine or you're pro-Israel, or you have to scream at each other from one end or the other. And it's just really important to learn from that experience. People who are deep in it, personally affected, and also are able to hold so much at the same time. So that's one story. And the other piece that I mentioned before is the absolute absence of the government. Just absolute absence of the government. Besides that, they haven't met with the kibbutzim, they've barely met with the families of hostages. The civil, like Jenna mentioned, civil society is running the country. The whole hostage operation, that's all volunteers. Delivering food, collecting supplies for people in the South. The entire country is being run by volunteers, by civil society. The government is not doing its job. They're just at best absent. And that's an important story that we need to learn. And, you know, it's a little bit of whiplash because we were living through the democracy protests over most of the last year. And then suddenly there's October 7th, but it's the infrastructure, the civil society volunteer infrastructure that was created through the democracy protests that is running the country. It's the exact same people who were leading those protests who are now running the response efforts.
And to what Rabbi Jacob said, just as the people who had organized the democracy protests are the ones running the country, the people with the military codes and the people who are theoretically running the country are the people who the people were protesting months ago. So it's a government that is extremist and is backed by some of the most extreme far right running the country. And another thing that felt really, really powerful is what role do North American Jews have in lifting up these experiences and being able to hold both truths because of the physical safety separation and physical distance that exists. And that's one of the really key questions that both Rabbi Jacobs and I are grappling with upon our return and thinking about what it means to guide Trua's work going forward around this issue, and what role morality and what role Torah and these deep ethical questions can have in shaping what it means to respond to war.
Rabbi Matt, okay, you just shared some. Do you want to read the questions that you just shared, or do you want me to?
You go ahead, because I'm still fielding stuff.
Okay, so I see 3 questions coming in. Again, send them to Matt. I'm not reading the chat, but one is, did we speak to any leftist politicians? We did not talk to politicians. Next trip. And then, any sense if there's negotiations for another humanitarian pause, and are there specific asks of what we can do? So negotiations, I did see a little item come across this morning. I can't remember, like Israeli Twitter or something, saying that there's rumors, or maybe Egypt reported there's some negotiations, but basically we don't know. Nothing has been fully reported. And I'm also aware Gershon Baskin, who negotiated the release of Gilad Shalit, he always says, whatever you see reported is just people posturing as part of the negotiations. We actually don't know what's happening in the background, so we don't know. We know that the families are really pushing because they understand that there's not that much time left. And related, Hamas needs to agree to hostage release and ceasefire. How can Israel accomplish these if Hamas won't agree? I mean, look, I'm not a military strategist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not involved in hostage negotiations. I never have been. We know that Qatar and Egypt were able to force the last temporary ceasefire and get the hostages released. So I'm hoping that could happen. But I am definitely not the person who's in those rooms and has any inside information.
And a couple of things that
Jenna, do you want to handle it?
Yes, I mean, and I think a couple of different things, and one of the most poignant things I've heard was from Rachel Goldberg, who is a mother of a hostage, who shared that what would it look like if everyone who was in the war room was replaced? Instead of them going in, they sent their mother instead, and what the impact of that would mean for hostage release. And that was such a powerful statement to the dire needs that so many people that we met with felt. And they overwhelmingly, the people we met with were saying, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. And to the other question of, is there an ask? It was so clear to them that the Israeli government doesn't have a plan, they don't have a day after plan, and that the US government and the US administration, Blinken and Biden, are basically, they might as well get an apartment in Israel at this point, because they're sitting and babysitting Bibi. The ask from so many Israelis was to, how can you be both thinking and pushing the US government to ensure that there's a day after plan, and there's a plan for this whole operation by Bibi and his government.
Yeah, absolutely that. I'll add one. This is just for everybody personally. Israelis are feeling really abandoned and lonely, and so happy when people come over. Not that many people are coming. There's not a lot of flights. It's only El Al. And I'm guessing that most or everybody on this call has Israeli friends and family who you reached out to right after October 7th. And I would say keep reaching out. People really appreciate it. Even if you don't know them that well, even if it's someone that you met once, they will appreciate it. And yeah, just like Jenna said, really pushing on both the goal of this war the day after and the long-term plan to make sure that this can't happen again, that we have some kind of different government in Gaza, getting the international community, Qatar, Egypt, the US, everybody involved, to make sure there's a long-term plan, both for Palestinians and also for Israel.
And I'll just echo the feeling on the ground, because it's related. Is I picked up a burger from Burger Bar on Ben Yehuda Street one night, and I had never felt it so empty in my life. And it really feels like people aren't there. And when I had dinner in Tel Aviv on our last night, the person I had dinner with was like, just so you know, I don't know if you've been in this situation before. Do you see that door across the street, how it's open? That's where you're going to run when there's a siren. And you're going to jump over this ledge, and that's what you're going to do. And just the feel and the sense of the ground is different. It's hard. We have a couple of questions about gender-based violence and what it means to be in conversations when there are these reports of gender-based violence, and about the impact of different world organizations, the UN, USAID, perhaps the Red Cross, and they deserve our support, and which ones are failing was another question. Rabbi Jacobs, do you want to take it? Do you want me to take it?
Do you want to start, and then I could jump in?
Sure. I think one of the things, I will speak to the different organizations. Something that we heard from many people is like the sense we heard that the Red Cross is glorified Uber. And at the same time, these organizations are doing really important work in accountability. And I think the basis of civil society that is taking place in Israel needs to be supported by these organizations as well. The Red Cross needs to be able to enter into both the hostage situation and to be allowed inside these Israeli prisons. That was something that we heard again and again from the people we were meeting with who work on prison, to see the impact of what is happening to the people who are there, and to ensure the safety of everyone who is there, to make sure that they have access to medical care, and to make sure that there isn't any form of torture taking place.
There's a few questions about how we deal with people on the left who are either denying what happened, or who are just denying both the gender-based violence and the general violence, who are just focusing on Palestinian deaths and not on Israeli deaths. And I'll say it is very challenging. We're in a very challenging moment right now. Tempers are very high. It's not a great moment for dialogue and conversation. And I can't say anything that's sweeping, that covers everybody. I think that there's some people and organizations who it's not really possible to have a conversation with, and then there's others who maybe have gotten swept up in the general tide who it is possible to have conversations. I've certainly had conversations, particularly with non-Jewish clergy, with Christian clergy, where we're able to talk about the nuance. If people are able to, if we already have a relationship, if they're able to hear, if they can hear that I can say, I'm worried about people in Israel, I'm worried about people in Gaza. But yeah, it's definitely a very hard moment. And it might be that there's some relationships that everybody in this call has relationships with people who are in different places in the political spectrum. So, you can determine how and if you can have and when you can have those conversations. But I think we're all trying to figure out the right time and way and who's responsive to those conversations. Okay, somebody asked, this is also very quick. Did we meet standing together? Amdim biyachad. Not in this, only because they were just in the US and we spent a lot of time with them. I was with them, I think, 3 times in that week. And Jenna, I was with them, I think, at least once. So we didn't feel like we needed to have coffee with them again in Tel Aviv, but they're certainly one of the many groups doing really extraordinary work. What question? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the next question is about concerns in Israel about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and the US. And absolutely, I think one of the really interesting dynamics that comes out of the fact that the US plays such a crucial role in shaping what the Israeli government does is that folks that we met with are deeply concerned and have many questions about what is happening in the US. And when we sat down, they were like, tell us everything you can about America. What do we know about America? And they had many questions about America. They're concerned about anti-Semitism. They're curious. They're hearing things through the grapevine about what's happening in America, and they're hearing big headlines. So they're like, we want you Americans to explain to us what you are experiencing. And it was really powerful to compare the experiences of how we were understanding activism in America versus activism in Israel as well, and to have those conversations.
Great. Okay, Matt is saying there's a question about the best way to publicly support peace efforts. What verbiage should we use? So just to say some of what we've said before. So I think holding the real pain and the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians is really crucial, and being able to not ignore October 7th, even as we're horrified by the deaths in Gaza, to continue to hold the horrors and the atrocities of October 7th and the hostages, and also the Israelis who are displaced from the north and from the south. So to hold all of that, we shouldn't shy away from talking about the thousands of children who have been killed in Gaza, the civilians in Gaza who have been displaced, the horrific humanitarian situation there. And we have to hold all of the pain and all of the grief at the same time. And what we're hearing is certainly move toward prioritize the hostages. So a return to a temporary ceasefire, humanitarian pause, whatever you want to call it, to release the hostages, and to really push Israel to say what the goals of the war is. Nobody is convinced that there is a strategy. There's more trust of the IDF than of the government, but what are the goals of this war, given that it's very hard to destroy Hamas, and also Hamas doesn't care how many Palestinians are killed. The leaders are hiding underground. And so is there even a strategy that would actually result in Hamas not being present that wouldn't kill thousands more children? So what's the strategy? What's the day after? And really to push that there needs to be an international effort to rebuild Gaza, to put a stable government that's not Hamas in place, whether that's a strengthened PA, whether it's some kind of international coalition, also not my department, but that the countries that have been involved, the US, Qatar, Egypt, the PA, have to be involved in figuring that out. And then, of course, moving toward a long-term two-state solution, which is ultimately the only way that we're ever going to be able to have some semblance of peace, even if it's a cold peace. And there's a lot of anxiety about, well, two states, right? How do we know they're not going to break through the border? And that might happen. There might still be fighting, right? Lebanon, why is Hezbollah firing on Israel? They're not being occupied. And that might be, but we do know that Israel has two peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, and they've held up for decades, and they are the best thing for Israeli security. And so it might not be a perfect peace agreement. It might be a very cold peace, but that's what we need to move toward, because as the people in the South have been saying for years and years and years and being ignored, there's ultimately not going to be a military solution. It's going to have to be a political solution. Matt, are there more questions? We maybe have time for one more.
Yeah, I think one of the pressing ones that came up a couple times that I was trying to synthesize is, could you speak to pushing back on the rise of anti-Semitism, standing up for Israel while also holding space for innocent Palestinians at the same time? Kind of, how do you be on a side that's neither side?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say for us, one of the most powerful things that we talked about is people in the deepest amount of grief, people who have lost their homes, people who have lost loved ones, are able to find the ability to hold both was so powerful to witness, that even in their grief, they were like, no, we need to speak up for Palestinian lives. We need to ensure that there isn't more war that endangers and kills more, because more people going through the pain that we experienced isn't sustainable and isn't the way to make a just world. Feels like an incredibly powerful narrative to uplift. Rabbi Jacobs, I'm curious if there's more that you're hoping.
Yeah, I mean, so there's, I mean, I'm personally very concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism. The Israelis we talked to all want to know what's going on in America. They were also really concerned and honestly shocked, especially groups on the left are surprised because they thought they were part of the global left and found out that there's people who can't see their pain. Something that TRA has done even before October 7th is to lay out parameters of when is it criticism of Israel and when is it anti-Semitism, because Israel is a country, it can be criticized just like you can criticize the United States or Canada or China or any other country that you feel like criticizing. And but sometimes that criticism crosses into anti-Semitism. So we've laid out, maybe Matt, you could put in the chat the link to our anti-Semitism booklet, which talks about how you can criticize Israel, even criticize Israel in ways that we all might not agree with or we think is wrong, but that's fine. You can also criticize America in ways that some of us might not agree with, that we might think is wrong. But of course, there's times when it crosses over into anti-Semitism, like if you're supporting the expulsion of 7 million Jews, if you're supporting violence against Jews, if you're denying Jewish history in the land, etc. So our booklet does lay that out, and we're trying to, especially now, be really clear about saying when people are being, when something is maybe criticism of Israel that we don't agree with, and when it crosses the line, especially as tensions are high and as there is more rhetoric that does cross the line. And also at the same time, we have to call it anti-Semitism. We also have to call out the increase in Islamophobia, including the shooting of three Palestinian college students not just a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes when it comes to anti-Semitism, sometimes the Jewish community thinks that we can deal with anti-Semitism in a vacuum, and that ends up actually endangering Jews more. We can't just circle the wagons and take care of ourselves. We have to be partnered with other communities and call out other prejudices without shying away from also calling out anti-Semitism. And so that's some of the complicated place where we certainly find ourselves. Okay, I think we are out of time. This recording is available, so I know some of you had to join a little bit late, or maybe have friends who weren't able to join. So there will be a recording afterwards. I wanted to really thank, first of all, Rabbi Jenna, who was my travel companion, and so for your presentation, as well as Victoria Cano and Rabbi Matt Druffin for making this call happen. And so I want to thank all of you. We would love to have your feedback on the program. So just in the chat, a little survey just appeared. Please take 60 seconds right now to click on that to fill out the survey. It's going to help us to know what went well and what we can improve for the next call. And I just want to thank you all for being with us and for being in this work with us. Thank you.